Welcome to Stranger Things in the 1980s. My name is Vince Locke. I'm your host. In this podcast, my guest and I take deep dives into the Upside Down, where we analyze each episode of the Netflix series along with related movies and books and examine them in the context of 1980s America. In this episode, I'm joined again by my friend Brian Stout, along with new guest Glen Birdsall, to discuss new wave music and the second episode of Stranger Things, Weirdo on Maple Street. Hey, welcome back to Stranger Things in the 1980s. This week, I'm joined again by friend and fellow nerd, Brian Stout. Brian, tell us again who you are and what you do.
So I'm Brian Stout. I live in Bloomington, Indiana. I am a writer. I build training for a living, but I like to write about films and music on the side. I have a blog. And just here to nerd out, basically.
Right on. And this time we're joined by another friend and fellow nerd, Glen Birdsall. Glen, who are you?
Well, you just said it. I'm Glen Birdsall. I don't know how far back I should go, but I'm a carbon-based life form. So I live in the mid-Michigan area. I'm a librarian at a nonprofit. I'm also a dork. I write poetry books. I've got one coming out in just a week from now.
Awesome.
So that should be fun. I just wandered through the woods and here I am.
Okay.
Kind of like Will in a way.
Good points. And Brian, again, as you said, you're in Indiana, so pretty close to Hawkins. So you got to watch out for that weird shit out there.
Yeah, there's plenty of weird shit in Indiana. I will tell you. I'm in probably, I think, one of like two bubbles of sanity in this whole state, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so last time I gave the homework assignment, which was to, of course, watch Chapter 2 of Stranger Things, The Weirdo on Maple Street, which we will talk about this time. But also I gave the homework assignment to do a little bit of background research on new wave music so that we'll discuss that and how that is represented and relates to the show. So let me ask you guys, what is new wave music?
So what is new wave music? So, new wave music comes out of, in a way, it comes from the punk movement. A lot of people use the term post-punk and new wave. There's a slight difference between the two, but generally people will interchange that a lot. It definitely was post-punk, so it does fit that name quite a bit. And the term new wave too, that came from that actually came from New York. The manager of CBGB's wanted to get away from the term punk rock because they thought it was a fad, and they kind of looked towards French new wave movie making, and thus the term new wave became new wave.
I did not know that.
But I think where it really attaches is, new wave at its peak happens, almost simultaneously with the advent of MTV.
Yeah, so I can see that.
MTV happens, in August of 1981, just a few years after new wave is kind of coming to fruition. And, MTV got to bring over a lot of the British new wave.
Yes.
And that's one of the things with the terms, new wave and post-punk. A lot of people will make the argument that technically post-punk is what we would call it here in America, and new wave is what they would really call it over there. And there
okay, that makes sense.
And there are some differences here and there, but so that's the beginning of it. But I could go on. We could have like a 5-hour thing on new wave. So I could just
See,
keep going.
I associate new wave specifically with British bands and British music, so it makes sense
Absolutely.
that it is a British sort of term for it. That makes more sense. Okay, Brian,
Well, that's
your
interesting
thoughts?
because I mean, for me, I think that it's really about how new wave is kind of like punk with the edges sanded off a little bit. Like it's a little more palatable, I think, to a larger audience.
Very good point.
Probably one of the best bands that kind of bridges that space is Talking Heads. I think would be one band that I would say is really, because they began in '77, so they were playing clubs like CBGB, and they did have more of a punk sound a bit initially, but as they've evolved, especially into the '80s, and they became more and more popular, they incorporated all sorts of different sounds into their music, and became more dancey and more accessible too. I mean, they became extremely popular in the '80s, due in large part to those music videos, I'd say.
Right.
Yeah, definitely.
That's interesting because most sort of musical movements come about as a response to something that preceded them. So if you look in the '80s at the rise of heavy metal and hair metal, it's a response to the slickness of the MTV pop music, and then that leads into grunge in the '90s and so forth. So I was wondering how new wave came about and what that was a response to, but making the point that it is post-punk or a response to punk, that makes a lot of sense actually to me, because a lot of these artists that we consider new wave, they do have punk roots.
Oh, they definitely do. And especially I like to always think about how, because we're Midwestern, and originally Brian's from this great state of Michigan, the Mitten. New wave here was the Knack, and it was the Romantics, which are both guitar-driven new wave. But when we think of new wave, we generally new wave, as Brian pointed out, is really kind of, it's made more as a pop sort of thing. And I think one of the things that kind of sanded the edges was them bringing in synthesizers.
Yes, I very much associate synth with new wave music.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But
the bands that also represent the Midwest that are in that major in that scene are Devo and the Pretenders also.
Absolutely, yeah.
So why was new wave music so important?
I mean, I think that it's because I think we've kind of hit on some of it already. I think just that advent of MTV, it was a new sound. Lots of things that were like synthesizers became extremely popular in the '80s. And I think just a lot of that music lends itself to some of the things that really work well in music videos, like some kind of surreal imagery. And then and we get a little bit further into the '80s and there's more like story-driven music videos. Like, for example, like the first band that I think of in terms of really capitalizing on that music videos, and then new wave is like Duran Duran, for example.
Yeah.
It's so many videos that were really iconic. In some ways they could kind of be called a boy band. They're kind of like a prototype boy band, in that everybody had their favorite person in the band, and like, oh, are you a Simon person, or oh, I like John, or whatever.
I remember Duran
they
Duran being huge, especially in the early '80s, and being a really big fan of it.
Yeah.
And there was a point later on in the late '80s and '90s where it became sort of unfashionable to like that sort of pop, new wave, Duran Duran kind of stuff. And so it became more like a guilty pleasure, or you just didn't admit that you liked it. But looking back at it now, I can say Duran Duran was really cool. Really good music.
Oh yeah, and they're still around.
Yeah, and they are.
They literally just released a new record, like I think last fall.
Yeah, and I mean that's a band who had lots of ups and downs in their career, but they always they made good music here and there. And the music that they put out now is just as good as the stuff that they started with.
And Brian, I think you're right in that the connection to MTV was one of the big driving forces to the popularity of new wave, but also new wave kind of drove MTV as well. because when you had mentioned Talking Heads, and I don't think of Talking Heads as like being punk, even though it does have punk roots, but to me it's much more like performance art, and that's perfectly suited for MTV, especially in the early days.
Yeah, new wave really made a mark because it was visual. You know, the way they dressed, the way they acted, the videos, as we've mentioned. It was, I think that's one of the things that made it what it was. And I think that's where its importance comes from. It started making music into a visual thing again, whether it was their outfits or the videos themselves. Before that, if Boston came to your town and they're walking through, you'd just be like, look at these long-haired dudes. I don't know who any of them are. But you know, you're gonna know the lead singer of Flock of Seagulls when he walks by you.
Yeah,
absolutely. And speaking of another band, Flock of Seagulls, that wasn't cool to like later on, dude, I Ran is such a great song.
Oh yeah,
it's amazing.
That, Glenn, I think you're so right about the like the way that the bands presented themselves, like their clothing choices and things. Like if you think about band like Duran Duran, really fashion heavy. Even Blondie also, as they began to have some music videos, obviously.
Human League.
Yeah, certainly. And then Devo as well. That was very very much, the presentation of it was very, very important.
And there are elements carried over from glam rock out of the 70s.
Definitely.
Yeah, I bet they would never say that, but it's true. They would say, no, not us. No, we don't like the New York Dolls or whatever. But
right,
yeah, it's true.
Well, I mean, one of the ones that's a very clear connection is from glam rock. You've got Roxy Music, and without Roxy Music, there's no Duran Duran.
Right.
I mean, that really is the beginning of that sound, that look, that very European sensibility.
Mm-hmm. And of course, members of Duran Duran would collaborate with Brian Ferry in Power Station.
Yeah.
So there is a connection there. There is a part of the DNA shared. So what effect has new wave music had on pop culture? How is it relevant today?
Well, I think that I always find that things, I have this like 20-year theory, or like sometimes I call it older brother theory or older sibling, where like the people are, are currently, at the front of things, like in their early to mid 20s, are usually taking influence from things that are from around 20-ish years ago. And I remember in the early 2000s, there were lots of bands that were making music that had a really strong 80s influence in new wave. And
that's a good point.
So there's, and a lot of it was actually, I mean, it was very popular in like the indie scene. I think some bands that some people who maybe weren't quite as clued into that, who might know, like Yeah Yeah Yeahs and LCD Sound System, are two bands that had definitely had taken some influence from that scene and got pretty popular.
There is that idea that everything old is new again. And so, and we see this not just in music, but in other fields such as art and literature and television, where you start to see a lot more sort of nostalgic throwbacks or retro things, such as Stranger Things being a retro throwback to the 1980s.
Right.
Yeah, and then now Yellow Jackets is doing the 90s thing.
Right.
90s are coming up. Yeah.
Other than new wave, the other term post-punk, you had bands like in the beginning there was a band called Wire. They were very post-punk back right before it became new wave. A few other bands that were like that, and that came back, that kind of sound came back very strong. And a lot of people do say that the second revival of post-punk starts with the White Stripes, where they're bringing back that stripped down, very angular guitar sound that was the pre-new wave sound, but it was the post-punk sound.
Mm-hmm. I can see that, or I can hear that rather.
Yeah.
That I think that it's kind of funny the way that there was, on the one hand, especially in that era, there was this kind of you know, one of the biggest selling points of the bands that were popular in that moment, the Strokes also maybe,
Yes.
is that there's this weird sort of lack of pretense, but there's also a really heavy emphasis on like style and looking cool. Interpol is another band that comes to mind that takes a lot from that.
Yeah,
Those
Franz Ferdinand.
earlier
Yes.
eras.
Franz
Yeah,
Ferdinand, I was
certainly
going
them
to mention,
too.
yeah.
Yeah. And actually now that is starting to spring up again in the UK. Like there are some bands that are coming out now that are kind of making that sound their own, but they're adding some new elements to it. I'm just starting to dip my toe into it, so I can't think of any bands off the top of my head that are
Right.
that come to mind, but it's definitely like starting to come back around again. Thus providing more evidence of my 20-year theory. So I'm happy about that.
Right. Australia's Cut Copy has a very strong Duran Duran sound.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, those guys make some cool, catchy music.
Yeah.
And like I said, music movements are often responses to what preceded them. So like without new wave, you wouldn't get heavy metal, or at least to the extent that we got it in the late 80s, which led into grunge and whatever came after. So yeah, without new wave, you don't get, let's say, Metallica, or you don't get a Nirvana, or at least you would get them, but they wouldn't receive the airplay and the sort of success that they had.
You know, it's interesting that you brought, sorry, Glenn. Go ahead.
Oh, I was also going to say, you know, how, you know, new wave is actually much more cross-cultural than we think as well. You know, you have, and this one's, I think, is one of the very big important parts of new wave via 1982 through 1983, a little bit in 1984 too. But you have Prince's attachment to that new wave sound, with Controversy in 1999, especially, a little bit in Dirty Mind as well. And I think what that brings to it is this idea of it being a cross-cultural thing. And also, you know, at the time, he's showing this androgyny that a lot of new wave really pushed, was this androgynous look.
Very much so.
And I think per culture that you're in, the importance is either small or big. And I think for some of them, some cultures, it's much bigger. A good example is, you know, when you compare David Bowie and Prince together, they both had this androgynous sort of thing with them where it made all of us who are the weirdos feel like we're accepted.
Right.
It's not overly masculine, it's not overly feminine, it's just this. So I think, you know, that's one of the great cultural things that Prince brought to new wave, was that kind of androgyny.
Prince and Bowie is a great analogy because they both have that steady pace of just reinvention continuously throughout their careers also.
They do. And we lost them both in the same year.
We did. I didn't realize that. Yeah.
It's a bummer. Yeah.
That was a terrible year.
It really was.
I felt like every other day I'd wake up and somebody else that was important to me was in like pop culture was dead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as we talked about in the previous episode, music and new wave in particular sort of dovetails nicely with Stranger Things, especially in the character of Jonathan, because we do see him as being the guy who is more interested in that alternative music and alternative pop culture. So this particular episode, the Weirdo on Maple Street, we do get references specifically to Bowie and Joy Division and television and the Smiths. So Jonathan is sharing this with Will in the flashback scene. And we get four sort of prominent needle drops in this episode, which are Should I Stay or Should I Go, which becomes a really important song, sort of almost a theme song for this particular season. We get Troopers Raise a Little Hell, although we only get a very small snippet of that. We get Modern English, I Melt With You, and then we get, interestingly, the Bangles version of Hazy Shade of Winter, which was originally a Simon and Garfunkel song. So,
and there's a problem here because that song was not out yet.
Which is true, and that is, it is interesting. That's Hazy Shade of Winter came out in '87. And there are two places in the first season of Stranger Things where they use songs. The songs were already out, but the versions that they use in the show are much later versions. So in the case of Hazy Shade of Winter, that was from the 60s. But then I think it's the next episode, we get Peter Gabriel's version of Bowie's Heroes, which was recorded, I want to say in 2010, although I'm not positive about that.
Can I make a statement about that too, by the way? Okay, so those are used as background for our brains. They're not really within the story frame. If the record was actually being used and like he's showing his little brother that, then it's part of the story.
Right.
We want it to be part of the correct time. But you know, as is, I feel like it works because it's pulling you into literally the purpose of the story.
And that's a good point, because both Hazy Shade of Winter and then Heroes, those are played during the end credit scenes. Right. Or the end credits, rather.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, I may give them a pass then, because it jumped out at me like a sore thumb. I was like, what is this? I don't even know if Less Than Zero had been written yet, the novel. At this
point.
Probably not. I mean, even though that is very much an 80s kind of novel.
Yeah. Yeah, it's...
So what are we to think of when it comes to these songs? How are we to make sense of them within the context of the story?
You know, there's the use of the Clash stuck out to me because I think that particular song, I mean, it is one of their more popular songs, but the idea, I mean, if you dig around in the words a little bit, you know, it's kind of interesting with somebody disappearing and coming back, and it kind of makes sense in that sense.
And we did talk about this a little bit last time, that many of these songs are used partly to create the sense of the time period, but also they're used for a thematic purpose as well. So yes, having Will in particular really like the Clash, Should I Stay or Should I Go, is thematically relevant to what happens to him in this particular story.
I think that the other thing is that this also kind of underscores the point we were making earlier about how things like MTV sort of brought these kinds of sounds to a more like a larger audience, you know, because the Clash has been around. By this point, the Clash was a huge band. Like they were really, really popular, but they had started out with a much more aggressive, gritty punk sound in like the late 70s, and you know, they also had some success with music videos. And I think you know, the prevailing wisdom is that, you know, some of the later era Clash stuff is not as good, you know, but it's
sellouts.
Yeah, I mean, it's well, but they also, I mean, you know, going back to and also kind of thinking about bands that continually reinvented themselves. I mean, they're also like a key example of that. Like, you know, toward the end of their career, maybe those records aren't so great, but like, you know, Sandinista era, they were like experimenting with hip hop sounds and reggae and things that maybe other bands that were quote unquote punk that weren't really doing much with that. So that was the thing I thought about with regard to the Clash. Another thing that stuck out at me and was that I think in that flashback scene where I think Jonathan says something to him about you know, this music will change your life, which is something that I think a lot of us have felt. You know, it got there's like, you know, flash forward, there's a part in is it Garden State where don't they make something reference to that about the Shins? Everybody's kind of made fun of it. Yeah. So, and then there's
It'll
a
change
really
your life. That line itself is used then too.
Yeah, and then there's also you know, there's a really noteworthy book about the 80s punk scene in America called Our Band Could Be Your Life. That's Michael Azerrad. It's a profile of a series of bands that didn't make the Stranger Things cut, but things like The Replacements and Husker Du and Black Flag, Dinosaur Jr. And so that statement kind of jumped out at me also, because I mean, you know, the people who are kind of, you know, could relate to some of what Jonathan is listening to or what he's into, you know, those are conversations I have with people all the time. Like, you've never heard blank? Oh, this is going to blow your mind. You know, it's so.
Right.
Yeah, it reminded me of that a bit.
Yeah, and that Clash album, Combat Rock, that was them dipping their toes into a more polished, or we would say, new wave sound. And I've also heard new wave described by other people as this whole idea that punk needs to become more experimental. So these were guys who were like, yeah, we did the sound, but let's try this and let's try that. And that's how a lot of people think that new wave evolved out of the punk movement.
I see.
And you can really see that with Adam Ant. You take his very first record.
Yes.
His very first record is really no different than a New York Dolls record or a Wire record or a television record. But then, he's turned into, Times Prince later on.
Now, one song that really stands out to me here is I Melt With You.
Yes.
First of all, let me just ask, what do you think of this song and the way it's used?
I'm not sure who's going here, but I'll just step in, I guess. How it's used here, it's great because it's used during I see it's two pieces here. It's the pool scene.
Mm-hmm.
So there's and I know this is like almost too obvious, but it's the whole liquid, the pool, all that. But it also has to do with like the two teenagers, and the sexual chemistry that they have together.
Yes, very much so.
Too. So you have both of those things happening. And then clearly, Barbara's about to get melted at some point as well. So
and that's I think interesting thing about the lyrics is it does have that sort of duality, and that it is about sex, but also it's about nuclear annihilation, right? So there is the sex and death duality being represented in that song, which I don't think most people are really aware of.
Total 80s.
Very much so.
Yeah. Two things we were most scared of in the 80s, right? Sex and nuclear war. Throw in a line about, playing records backwards, and I think we've covered it all, right? For slasher movies.
Right. So the thing about I Melt With You is I remember this being a really big hit song in the 80s. But when I looked it up, it really wasn't. It didn't even crack the top 40. So am I misremembering? What's your sense of it?
I Melt With You. I mean, I think its big thing was its use in movies. That's where it really caught on.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing with it too is, I don't know if you guys are aware of modern English or not, or have any of the records. I'm kind of a new wave dork, so I might have too many new wave records, to be honest, but it's really a weird song for them because all their other stuff is closer to like a Joy Division sound. It's really dark. It's very strange. It's kind of like the darkest Depeche Mode stuff. And I Melt With You is very poppy.
It is very poppy, very upbeat, which kind of belies the lyrics to some extent.
And it's very different from every song that they've ever done.
Okay.
And I think that might have hurt them making it into a big single, because once people bought the record, they were like, what is going on? What is this song?
That's interesting. I remember, I feel like it's been in a lot of commercials.
It is, or has, yes.
I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I had the impression that it was a song that maybe wasn't huge at the time, but has really become kind of a classic over the years.
And I think that's probably accurate because it has been licensed for advertising and movies, more so in the 90s and 2000s.
Right.
And I think that may be the cause of my confusion is seeing it or hearing it being used in commercials in the 90s and recognize it as being an 80s song. I think that sort of tricked me into thinking that it was more popular than it actually was back in the day, because I was hearing it so often in these ads.
Right. Yeah, no, its big thing was it was the closing song for Valley Girl.
Yeah.
that movie with Nicolas Cage.
Ah, that's where
So, you know, as soon as they were kind of together at the end, and you weren't sure if they were really together, because the end kind of has that Graduate feel,
Hmm.
where they're both kind of together, but they're not together, and you're like, what is going to happen next? That's the song that just starts blasting at the very end of that. And I think that's where its popularity came from.
I think that's where people really became aware of it for the first time. Yeah, I think you're right there. There is something I was reading fairly recently about this theory in anthropology called mediation. And I'm probably going to oversimplify it. But the idea is that our sense of the world is shaped through popular media more than through our own personal experiences. And so the way that we interact with the world is based on the way popular media teaches us to interact with the world. We have to remember, or we have to keep in mind, that Stranger Things isn't a product of the 1980s. Rather, it is an interpretation of the 1980s. That is an imitation of the cultural products of the 1980s that we grew up with. And so going back to I Melt With You and me sort of misremembering its popularity, I think it's because, again, going back to advertising and hearing it so often there, but still recognizing it as from the 80s, that kind of tricked me into misremembering what the 1980s were fully. Or having an experience of the 1980s that I didn't actually have. I was just kind of tricked into thinking that I had it through the use of popular media.
Right.
What do you guys think about that?
Well, I think that kind of, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me on some level. I think especially for people who maybe weren't around at the time, their sort of broad strokes impression of the 80s is, boils down to probably like a handful of movies, a handful of bands, and a handful of fashion trends. And then if they're super nerdy about it, they might remember some political things. But it's, I mean, and that's kind of like if you ask someone about the 90s, they would probably say what, like Pulp Fiction, Forrest Gump, Nirvana, flannel shirts, Doc Martens, or something along those lines, maybe Green Day. Like, it's and those, it's funny, actually, it's funny to think about that, because it's when you think, now that those things have been around long enough that we have seen sort of a reinvention or like a callback to them. Those are the points that, those are the things that emerge, right? Those are the things that are the trends. Like, I think I talked about this maybe last week, but like when I was at Target a few weeks ago, like you look through their like men's novelty tees and they've got all this 90s stuff there. There's like, Ice Cube, Tupac, Nirvana, Smashing Pumpkins. Like it's interesting that we're sort of, I think it's interesting in that there's certain things that become signposts of that era, and those are the things that people who weren't there for it latch on to, or that's kind of their impression of it. And so it's kind of fun to play with that.
We have a yearning for something that wasn't actually real. I'm not really saying that very well, but.
Well, I think with us, and I think with most people that are nerds or dorks at that time, not to say that we're nerds or dorks. I should have worded that differently. Okay, we are nerds and dorks, but
yeah, I own that. But
yeah, my thing wasn't Smashing Pumpkins or Tupac. You know what I mean? Because I think we latched on to other things at times. And what they're looking back is to what they're saying is like, oh, these were the popular things back then.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
So like the more general public, thinks of things like, flannel shirts.
So they're getting a false impression of what was really popular at the time, just because it was something that had mass market appeal.
Exactly.
Or maybe not so much that it's.
I was a Brit Rock kid, so I wanted Suede, or the band Pulp. I wasn't really a Smashing Pumpkins person.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I liked a lot of different. I mean, I was always kind of dipping in about 20 different things at once. I'm always just devouring that. But there's a lot of things that you just said that were interesting to me. One is that I was thinking about how, I mean, I think that a couple of these bands that they mentioned directly, like Joy Division, I mean, I guess people know, probably more people know Joy Division for what happened to Ian Curtis than the actual music, or maybe they know like Love Will Tear Us Apart. And then Television, I think, is a band that seems to have kind of entered the conversation maybe around that 2000s a bit, you know, like because like the Strokes were borrowing so heavily from the sound of Television and some of those other bands.
Right.
You know, I mean, with a show like this, of course, they want to, you know, the nostalgia is the key element, right? I mean, part of the biggest selling point here is that you're going to be excited to see the Evil Dead poster on the wall or hear them make a reference to David Bowie or the Smiths or whatever.
And I think
So,
within the context of the series, that's really what it's being used in order to delineate or reveal something about Jonathan's character in relation to, say, Steve and Nancy.
yeah, yeah, that I going building on that a little bit. That Raise a Little Hell song that totally stuck out to me, and I love the way this show uses music to just kind of like create the camps, so to speak.
Right.
Right.
You know, there's like the popular kids are listening to these things that are really kind of like radio hits and or have like a really kind of like, you know, without being like a snob about it, like kind of a more generic rock sound.
Yes.
Or like, you know,
Stuff that's more accessible and stuff
yeah,
that they're going to hear on the radio.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we should always remember too is like this show's written by guys who would have been that age at that time. So it's, I mean, it's really, really ingrained in them. And that's why, you know, it's in here.
Yeah, I mean, it is very much an homage or a love letter to these
Right.
experiences or these
I mean, if
cultural
we were
products.
if we were writing this show, the three of us, and it was about kids, probably be no different because we grew up during this time. So these are the kids we understand.
Right.
The kids
That's a
that were
good point.
listening to Joy Division and Television, or playing D&D, or running around talking about Star Wars.
Right.
And this is us as kids.
Yeah.
And really, that's kind of the point I was getting at with the whole idea of mediation. Is this is an interpretation of the 1980s, but it is really reflective of my experience, even though my experience is very much shaped by my perception of what the 80s was like, which wasn't necessarily everyone else's perception.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit more about other aspects of this particular episode. You mentioned the Evil Dead poster, and we do see several movie posters in here. Evil Dead, there's a Dark Crystal poster on Mike's wall, and then there's a poster for Jaws on Will's bedroom wall. How does that connect, do you think, to the show? How do they connect?
Jaws is an interesting one because clearly, even just from the poster itself, it's showing the upside down. You know,
what do you mean by that?
Well, Jaws is under the person that he's going to be attacking.
That is true.
It's another world. There's the surface where the swimmer is.
I did not.
Yeah, I didn't.
And Jaws is beneath that surface. He's
right. It's sort of the upside down. Yeah.
It is the upside down in a way when you think about how an ocean is, right? We don't know all the monsters under there.
That's a really good point.
Wow. That's nice. Good idea.
And so, yeah, there is that thematic resonance. I mean, there's also a bit of foreshadowing, I think, in that, of course, Jaws is about a shark, and sharks are attracted to blood in the water. And that's exactly what happens to Barb at the end of this episode is, you know, she's bleeding in the water, and that causes the Demogorgon to appear.
Ooh, further underlining this Jaws thing. Yeah, I mean, the easy read on the Jaws thing is that this series is so obviously indebted to like the Spielberg.
Yes.
And
another Spielberg connection.
Yeah. Now this Evil Dead poster. Now this one kind of. It's obviously a major 80s touchstone, and of course we love it because it's Michigan too. You know, shout out for Sam Raimi and Royal Oak, Michigan, and
love Sam Raimi. And in fact,
Yeah.
Glenn, I think it was you who introduced me to Evil Dead.
Is it really?
Yeah, because it wasn't on my radar in the 80s. It wasn't until I was in college that I'm like, Evil Dead became such a cool thing.
Right.
Yeah. It's, I mean, I think what's interesting about it is that is not, I mean, I'm wondering like how they would have that on their radar. I know it was kind of like road showed, if you will. I know it was, I mean, that's kind of the way some of these films got around.
It is one of those classic drive-in horror movies.
And so I feel like I mean, I can see why it's there on the surface because it's definitely a touchstone of that early 80s. But I do, it's interesting. I wonder if they like sneaked into the drive-in to watch it because man, it's a pretty gnarly movie. It didn't even carry a rating when it came out.
Right, and I expect so because like I said, even in the 80s, it really wasn't. It wasn't a mainstream movie. It was very much something that it was on the fringes.
Yeah.
Right. And
but that's a good point, though.
That's how I saw it. I mean, I saw it at the drive-in.
Yeah, that's a good point, though, both of you, because a lot of these kinds of films, they really did make it like they did kind of bypass the distribution channels of like being at the the big multiplex or whatever. They did wind up doing a drive-in circuit. Like they'd wind up being the second movie at the drive-in. You might have gone to see, I don't know, whatever. Maybe you went to see The Thing, and then Evil Dead was like the movie that came after it.
Right.
And there was there was an entire scene of that in the 70s and into the 80s when drive-ins were still really popular. And so, I think it's probably that. I mean, I think I might have mentioned this before, but like, yeah, the drive-in was the place I got to see all the movies that my parents wanted to see, but they wouldn't dare take me to the theater to see. Like, that's where I saw the rated R movies, was at the drive-in. And so, it could be something like that. It's obviously got kind of a rural setting, so there's a connection there too. It's not quite as, Evil Dead's a little more remote than Hawkins, but
it still has that cabin in the woods trope. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the other things that's interesting is, there's a lot of things about Evil Dead that do remind me of Stranger Things. Will's house doesn't look much different than the cabin in Evil Dead.
Oh yeah.
Very
it's
much.
Very run down. It has that same kind of porch almost.
And I'm not positive about this, but I think there is a porch swing at the Will's house, which I always connect with the cabin in Evil Dead.
Right.
So it very much has that Evil Dead cabin vibe.
Yeah, and that's one of the cool things about Evil Dead is rather than a lot of the horror movies that happened in the 80s, you have a monster that is very definable. The Howling is a werewolf.
Yeah.
In Evil Dead, it's an undefinable monster. And same with Stranger Things. The monster is technically something that's very undefinable.
And it is something which is sort of eldritch and from a different dimension.
Correct.
Very much in the Lovecraft kind of vein.
Yeah.
Right.
And of course, we're meant to associate, Evil Dead with Jonathan. It's on his wall in his bedroom, and of course, he's the kind of the outside kid who would be into, cultish stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Dark Crystal, we see that's in the wall of Mike's bedroom. How about that one?
Mike is very much. I had a friend like Mike. In fact, his name was Mike. Now that I start thinking about it, back then, and he was the kid that first ended up with the very first Dungeons and Dragons that came out, and none of us knew. Even he was like, "I don't know what this is. Let's figure out how to play this thing."
Okay.
And those original Gary Gygax sort of Dungeons and Dragons books, and that's the kid that's going to have the Dark Crystal stuff.
Right, that dark fantasy.
Dark fantasy.
Yeah. So I didn't really see Dark Crystal when I was a kid. I mean, I was aware of it, but it just didn't really appeal to me at the time. And in fact, I really didn't see it until like maybe 10 years ago. So how do you think it connects to the world of Stranger Things?
Well, it's been quite a long time since I saw it, but I'm thinking about how I'm sure it was very, I mean, just thinking about it as an entertainment option, it just seems like it'd be right in their zone, right? Because it's got creatures and it's kind of a mythical story. You know, I don't think
Yeah,
there's
and
a
you
human
mentioned
being.
the Skeksis there are very much in the same similar vein to the Demogorgon in
Yeah,
design.
and I don't think there's a human being in it, if I remember correctly, right?
No,
No.
there's a couple scenes where they had to put somebody in a similar suit.
Mhm.
I can't remember the main character's name, but he has to like jump from like this globe type thing onto something else, and they just couldn't figure out how to do it with puppets.
Hmm.
So they have like, I think a teenager do it in like the same suit.
Okay.
But yeah, no, there's no actual
Yeah.
people in
No
there.
human characters. Yeah.
Hmm.
None.
I mean, it seems like that would really appeal to them too, because they do like to be a part of these things that are fully immersive, like where you just kind of get to forget who you are, or really just kind of be something else or be part of
Hmm.
something else that's not part of the surroundings that you're in all the time.
I see. The only connection that I can think of is how in the Dark Crystal there are these two races. You have the Skeksis, of course, who are very much the race of darkness, and then there's another group whose name I can't remember, who are sort of beings of light. And as the story reaches its conclusion, you come to realize that these two races were split off from one particular race. It's the light side and the dark side of this uh, older ancient race, that when the crystal was broken, it fractured them into the good and the bad parts. And so that sense of duality, I like I said, the only connection that I see is to the duality between Eleven and Will, and then our world versus the Upside Down.
Right, right. The Skeksis, and I think that the gen they were known as the gentle ones. I remember in like Marvel comics, but I think they're called the Uru or the Ura.
That sounds about right. So, and we do see another connection, as we talked about in the last episode, another connection between Eleven and Mike, and how they are in many ways kind of reflections of each other. Uh, 11 has a pillow fort in Mike's basement that were meant to, I think, connect to Castle Byers, which was Will's fort in the woods.
Oh, yeah, I didn't think about that. No.
And last time, Brian, we were talking about 11's name and what that particularly means. And you had mentioned the point that 11 represents a one-to-one sort of ratio or comparison between her and Will.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it occurred to me that, oh, yeah, the number 11 being composed of two ones, it's a mirror reflection. So it's a palindrome. In other words, it reads the same way forward and back. So there's another connection there between 11 and Will, and that sense of duality.
Yeah, and there's also a very, I think this one's stretching it, guys. So I'm really pushing my luck on this one.
Okay.
But I think that there's this kind of strength about her that you can find in Shakespeare's 11th Sonnet. So read that later on, everybody that's even listening.
Okay.
Nice.
Try that out. I mean, it's very interesting to go, oh, I wonder if this is about 11.
I will definitely take a look at that. I can't remember it offhand.
But when, one of the things looking back at that too, that I just wanted to mention, and I'm sure this is going to happen a lot in the show. I did want to mention something that you guys were talking about last time, and it was 11's hair.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think of when I pictured it was something that I might be wrong, but she reminds me of Joan of Arc at that point.
Oh, that's a good point.
But that's kind of my thing, is like, thinking back at the Hero of a Thousand Faces and all of
Yes.
Joseph Campbell's stuff. I always like try to think of like what mythological thing is that. In mythology, there are actual factual mythologies like Joan of Arc or other characters like that, or the actual Hercules. And I think of Joan of Arc when I see Eleven over and over again. The more I see her, the more I think of Joan.
I didn't make that connection, but now that you mention it, I can totally see it.
I mean, she's really this battle hero that's there to do things that, and with her, with her powers, they seem in a way almost like Joan's godly given powers.
Yeah,
Right.
Supernatural
this whole
element to them. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we are very much dealing with that Joseph Campbell hero's journey paradigm.
Right.
And we had touched on this a little bit last time, and when we mentioned that there are references in the first episode to other sort of fantasy worlds, most notably The Hobbit and then Alice in Wonderland. But it occurred to me that there was another reference, which I completely missed at the time, that plays into that trope as well. And that is when we looked at the song Africa by Toto. And of course, Toto, the name of the band, is a reference to Dorothy's dog in Wizard of Oz, which is another story of those, the hero's journey where a young person has to go off into this fantasy world and then overcome these monsters in order to find the way home. Right.
And like Joan, Eleven's not choosing to be this hero. She doesn't really, it's a divine thing. Something has pushed her into it.
Yes.
And, it's not really Dorothy's choice either. Dorothy's just trying to get home.
Exactly. And that is a standard part of the paradigm of the hero's journey, is that call to adventure and the refusal of the call. Right. It is a reluctant hero. Okay, some other things that I do want to mention about this episode. The title, The Weirdo on Maple Street, is a reference to Twilight Zone. And in the original Twilight Zone series, there was an episode called The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. Mm-hmm. And then in the early 2000 reboot of the show, they remade that episode and called it The Monsters Are on Maple Street. Are you familiar with that episode or either of those?
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Can you summarize it or give a synopsis?
From my memory, it's one of the episodes that Rod Serling actually wrote too.
He did write it, yeah.
And basically it's this, if I'm remembering right, it's this neighborhood that keeps thinking that something's coming to it.
Right. And there is something they see in the sky that causes the electricity to go out in this small town neighborhood.
So they all panic, trying to protect themselves, but then they all, in doing so, start to hurt each other.
Right.
In different ways, and thus showing that they're the real monsters.
Exactly. So the idea was, in the original episode, there is a speculation that what they see in the sky is aliens. And so there's a kid in the neighborhood who says, well, this is, I've read these stories about alien invasions, and this is exactly what happens. And so they start getting paranoid about each other, thinking that aliens are among them. And then in the remake in the early 2000s, they get rid of the alien angle, and the cause of the electrical, blackout is the government, the military. Because they're testing the neighborhood to see how they would react to a terrorist situation. So this was after 9/11, and so the monster of the time period were terrorists. And in that case, again, the idea of the paranoia that the people are turning on each other, seeing each other as terrorists. And really, as you say, they are the monsters themselves. How does that connect to this episode? Or to Stranger Things in general?
Well, one thing that comes to mind for me maybe is just that, much as you said that there was a reinvention of, what made people turn into monsters, we have a disappearance of a child, which we talked about that being such a grave thing. I mean, it's always a grave thing, but, it was really heightened in the 80s in particular. And so it's not it's not too far to think about the idea that, if somebody were to have remade that episode in like 1981 or something, that might not be that would have made a great catalyst for that episode. Honestly, there's a missing child. I can kind of see it in my head, right? So they're all out there looking around. I bet you did it. Oh no, I bet you did it. I saw you with him last time, or I saw you with her. I could totally see something like that happening.
That paranoia and people turning against each other.
Exactly. And then, because we're not at a point where people really know 11. So I don't think that she's really she's not like, she's obviously the weirdo on Maple Street,
right? That
they're referencing the title, but her presence is not widely enough known, I think, in Hawkins at this point for that to really be, for her to be the, the quote unquote monster. So, but there is this really, you can see as they do the investigations and things, they all are kind of like, and it also makes me think of, we haven't talked much about the murder of the guy who, his name escapes me, the guy who owns the diner.
Benny.
Right.
Yeah. And
it's in this episode that the police discover his body, and it's presented as a suicide.
Right.
And it's I think it's interesting in that scene when Hopper is in the diner, Benny was a friend of his, and one of the officers says, well, I guess this makes you feel like a big city police officer again. And Hopper says, well, I mostly dealt with strangers back then.
Exactly.
So we get that reference again to strangers and Stranger Things, but also the idea that, well, in the big city, I was dealing with people that I didn't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he made reference specifically to them being friends also.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that actually, that word stranger coming up again, it reminded me of something else that, and this is kind of off track, but I wanted to throw it out there. But when then that conversation in the flashback with Jonathan and when they're talking, and he says, your dad wants you to like normal things.
Mm-hmm.
That term really stuck out at me, because
yes.
Here's the guy who likes Joy Division and the Smiths and all these things that are kind of like on the outside the radar in the 80s.
And he tells Will, never let someone tell you what you should like.
Yeah. And and they were talking about it with regard to like, does he ever take you to play video games, or do you ever, like just that whole idea of him not showing much interest in the things that his kids are into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wants to take him to a baseball game.
Right. And as a whole other podcast, but I can like relate to that on a level. Mm-hmm. My children are obsessed with animals, and I could not care less. Like they ride horses, they love, anytime I go to the park and they see dogs, they flip out. Like I'm just indifferent to animals, but my kids are crazy about them. And
you monster.
I know.
So yeah, I think the connection that I make, apart from of course 11 being the sort of alien in their midst, is the idea of the paranoia of the 80s, especially during the Cold War. So the idea that the Russians are amongst us or spying on us in some way, because at the end of the season, when the Wheeler family learns about 11, the dad's like, is she Russian? So yeah, that idea of just paranoia and people turning against each other, and the government being such a nefarious organization.
Right. But in the 80s, what's interesting about that is like back then we trusted our own government probably too much. Mm-hmm. To be fair, it was the other governments that were wrong, not ours at all.
Right. Yeah. And it's really, coming out of the 70s, and I mentioned this last time, after Watergate, that's when America really starting to distrust its government.
Yeah.
It's interesting
for the most part.
Because I was just thinking that when you were saying it, just that idea in the 70s, we became, that's an era that's got a lot of just sort of, the country kind of awakening to the concepts that the government is not always doing things that are in our favor, and they do a lot of things we don't know about that are very underhanded. And then it's interesting, like when you think about the part of what Reagan sort of you know, part of his messaging that was so, you know, that worked so well was that kind of like, you know, he sort of brought people back from that in a
Right.
sense, and got them back to this kind of like, you know, let's all rally around the government and things. But it's interesting because this also made me think of how those 2 points that you mentioned for Maple Street are what we're talking about now, and then the time that it was originally put together. Like, you know, Russia was very much the bad guy.
Yes.
Both times out, and that unifying villain is something that we've tried to use over and over again to get everybody back on course, right? You know, and it was, you know, it was not Russia in 2001, but it was, you know, we try, you know, Iraq has been our villain for a couple different times, and so is Afghanistan. And it's an interesting thing like this. For some reason, we find it appealing or easy to, or it's a good way to corral people back by finding some sort of common enemy.
And an enemy that is sort of amorphous and abstract. You know, it's not a particular Russian, it's Russia, or it's not a particular terrorist, it's terrorism.
Right, or it's communism.
Right.
You know, at that point. And that's kind of one of the motifs you see over and over again in the different versions of the Body Snatcher. Body Snatchers movie.
Oh yeah, certainly.
This idea that your neighbor looks exactly like you, but he's not like us.
Exactly.
He's a communist, or AKA a pod person.
Right.
They all think alike, and they're all out to get you.
Yep.
As Kevin McCarthy runs through the streets at the end of Body Snatchers.
And that's the moral, I think, of the Twilight Zone episode, is the monsters are on Maple Street, that the monsters are among us. And there is a danger of turning against each other based on some amorphous fear.
Right.
So a couple other points. Michael Myers is referenced here in Halloween. Now, last time we had talked a little bit about John Carpenter and his influence on Stranger Things. Halloween is represented here specifically in that 11, the boys, Lucas and Dustin, are like, you know, she must be like an escaped mental patient like Michael Myers in Halloween. Is there any thematic resonance between Halloween and Stranger Things here?
Well, it's the first thing that pops into my head is that we didn't really call him Michael Myers for a minute. We called him the Shape. He's often referred to as the Shape, and I think that's how John
in the original movie,
yeah, that's how John Carpenter typically refers to him also.
And he's
so
not identified as Michael Myers until later on in the movie when Dr. Loomis explains who he is.
Yeah, I mean, often he's known as well as the Boogeyman.
Yes.
Yeah,
and,
certainly.
There's a lot of
He's the monster on that street.
Yes.
Yes. But there is, I think, a relationship. It's a reverse relationship between Michael Myers being pursued by Dr. Loomis and 11 being pursued by Papa, Dr. Brenner. So I think it's not quite foreshadowing, I don't think, so much as a foiling, and that the situation of Halloween is reflected in an opposite way with what's happening here.
And the two L's in the middle of Halloween look like 11. So
that's a good point.
Yeah, very true.
That might be reading a little too much into it, but that's a good
Absolutely.
point.
I'm very good at that. So
yeah. Oh, that's. Yeah, I think you remember when I was obsessing on Magnolia. So I've got a million of those. Like, oh, there's an 8 here, there's 2 there. Yeah.
Okay, and then we do get some foreshadowing, as I mentioned, with Jaws. We see the Jaws poster just before what happens to Barb. We see a Ouija board. We only see it very briefly. It's only a glimpse of it. But when Mike hides 11 in his closet, and she has that flashback to being put into the isolation chamber, there on a shelf in the closet there is a Ouija board. How does that connect?
I think it's kind of a direct connection. I mean, a Ouija board is like a cell phone to the other side. You know, it's literally how you contact the upside down.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And that is how Will communicates with Joyce. She basically makes a Ouija board on her living room wall with the Christmas lights and painting the letters on there.
Mhm.
And then we get Yoda in here. What's the connection there?
Moving objects. Clearly,
Yeah.
the Force can do that as
Oh,
well
yeah,
as
yeah.
telekinesis.
Very much so. And I think that's the connection we're meant to draw, is that he's showing 11, this is Yoda. He can move objects with his mind. He uses the Force, and that's exactly what she is able to do. And then going back to recurring themes, trust is mentioned again 3 times in this episode. Hopper says to Joyce, a little bit of trust here, all right? And Joyce responds a couple moments later, come on, how about a little trust here? This is when they're talking about how she claims to have heard Will over the telephone. And then Mike says, just trust me, okay, to 11. So we get that trust element coming back and being hit on pretty hard here in this episode. And the final question I was going to ask you guys, why does Jonathan go off into the woods at night to take pictures? When I first several times watching this episode, I didn't, have a problem with that. I didn't really notice it as being unusual, but now looking at it, that's kind of a weird thing to do.
If I remember correctly, in this episode, isn't there a point where he is like taking pictures of the party?
He does, because
cool
he's in
party?
the woods taking pictures and he hears someone screaming. And so he runs through the woods and finds them at the pool, pushing each other into the pool. And so he starts taking pictures of them.
Well, I assumed he was carrying the camera around as trying to find evidence for his brother.
Okay. I mean, that's kind of the connection, or that's what I thought initially. But then why at night? I mean, from a storytelling standpoint, that does allow him to take a picture of the Demogorgon without realizing it. So it does further the plot in that sense. And it does help to establish his interest in photography. But it just struck me as kind of weird and kind of creepy.
Yeah, that's really where I landed with it too. Is just kind of like, this guy's just kind of weird. And
well, I mean,
I think
his purpose wasn't the party. I mean, he didn't know that was happening.
Right.
Yeah.
He wasn't trying to be, skeevy or anything like
Right.
that.
It wasn't like a voyeur type deal.
Exactly.
Yeah. This is a bit of a stretch, and I don't even like this film, but it reminds me in a sense of how in American Beauty, Ricky is continually carrying around the video camera, and he's always trying to capture these, alleged like moments of living or whatever.
Right.
And he's super weird, and like most people, except for the one person in this movie, thinks he's like total weirdo. And
right.
So
maybe Jonathan is the weirdo on Maple Street.
I
think that's interesting, because the other teenagers do look at him as being a weirdo.
That totally makes sense, because he's a pretty big driver of this episode.
Yes.
And also, and as I mentioned earlier, 11's not really on everyone's radar yet.
Right.
So there's kind of a duality there. I think so. I don't think it disproves any of the ideas that we have from earlier, because 11 being kind of an unknown quantity is part of the whole angle of the Monsters of Due on Maple Street also.
Right. She's the obvious suspect and part of that Twilight Zone story is trying to identify who who the aliens are, or who the terrorists are in the neighborhood.
But maybe as like a known quantity, he probably would be the weirdo on Maple Street.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go back and watch this again now with that in mind. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Any other points you guys want to bring up?
Last time out, we were talking about some of those comparisons to Firestarter, and I noticed that at one point when 11 uses her powers, her nose bleeds, which is something that also happens in Firestarter.
Yeah, more so to Andy, the father in Firestarter.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that's interesting too, I think, is the dialogue, not just in this scene, but it does happen quite a bit in this scene. But most of the dialogue between these teenagers that are talking, you know, it seems to be spot on for not only the times, but what they think and what they feel like. It's not very sitcom-y.
Right.
It's more, you know, this is how kids really.
It is naturalistic.
It's very naturalistic, and I'm mentioning that too because we're so close to March 24th, which is you know, the Breakfast Club Day.
Oh.
So, you know, you have that sort of, here's them bonding together in different ways, and you have all these different cliques.
Yes.
You know, not necessarily with the 4 youngest kids that in 11, but with the teenagers themselves.
Yes.
So you're seeing Barb, you're seeing the rich kid with his family gone, and then you're seeing the 2 bratty kids who are, you know, could really be seen as Emilio Estevez's character, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean there are very much
Steve
specific
kind of,
character types.
Yeah, Steve's like the enlightened Estevez that emerges at the end of the movie.
Right, exactly. Then you have, you know, Bender running around with his camera.
Yeah.
Outsider,
for sure.
kind of gruff and doesn't have a great home
wrong
life.
side of the tracks. Yep. Still fitting clothes. Yeah. You know, that's something else that's interesting to me. I noticed that you know, part of the way that they sort of communicate that, you know, the Byers family is kind of, you know, in a tougher situation. I noticed that those kids' clothes always have like a weird fit.
And Joy says that people are always making fun of Will for his clothes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just another little nuance. I mean, it totally, like, you know, being a person who grew up in the Midwest, and, you know, it certainly rang true for me. I think there's a lot of like authenticity to. Are the Duffer Brothers from the Midwest? Does anybody know?
I don't know. I'll have to look that up.
Because a lot of it feels so lived in. I mean, there's parts of it that anybody could, you know, come up with on their own. You know, like anybody could come up with a craft like a Spielberg homage and things like that. But there's some parts of this, just like you were saying earlier, that are they're so lived in. It does feel like something that, oh, they're from North Carolina.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
And you're reminded in this episode too that you know, teenagers, their currency is their social lives.
Right.
And I don't think we grow out of it as much as we think we do, but back then it really is all you have.
Yes. You know, if you're popular,
you know,
if you're not popular, you're nothing.
You're nothing. And you know, you have Barb's character and you have these other characters, and then you're watching how they're all, like, you know, interacting together. And sometimes, you know, the older sister and what she does going up the steps at that point, you kind of look down on her to some degree for leaving Barb, but you know, you forget that that's what they have. That is their currency.
Yeah. I identify with Barb probably more than I'd like to admit. And on that note, so then homework. Next episode, we're going to take a deep dive into X-Men and the Dark Phoenix saga in particular. So there's no other topic, special topic to do any research on, but we're going to talk about X-Men. So by all means, do some research on that if you want to. So Glenn, Brian, I want to thank you guys for joining me. And anything you want to plug?
I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're more than welcome, and you're more than welcome to come back.
Thank you.
That's cool. I again, I have some articles that are out in the world for the magazine here in Bloomington called The Writer. So I do some film criticism and music criticism for them, and I've also got some writing online at a website called Words and Music Club. that is a bunch of friends of mine who write. We choose a theme, and then we pick a song, and then we write some kind of creative writing element associated with it. So it could be anything from like stories to essays. So really, I plug that more so for my friends who write some really terrific things on there. I'm really excited to be associated with that. There's a lot of really talented people on that site.
Awesome. Well, again, guys, thanks for joining me. And then I will talk to you again next time. So until then, take it easy, take care, and watch out for those Stranger Things. Stranger Things in the 1980s is produced by Dread Pirate Productions. Cover art is by Sherry Archer. The theme music is Cobalt by Alex Bloxham, used under license from Filmstro. Send questions or topic suggestions to dreadpirateproductions@gmail.com.